Video games represent a new way of interacting with an audience, with the potential to do so in a much more meaningful and intimate way than any medium has been able to do so far. But unfortunately, game audio still trails other art forms when it comes to innovation in artistic expression. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is why we haven't reached aesthetic innovation in the audio within video games. Because as you'll see, I believe that audio has the ability to affect people on a deeper level than you might expect, perhaps even a subliminal level that the audience isn't even aware of. And as you'll also see, I believe that video game audio hasn't even begun to scratch the surface of what's possible artistically. So I'm going to lay out a path today for how they might begin to. And that's what we're going to explore together. Now, if you're like most people out there, when you think about video game audio, something like this probably comes to mind. Game audio has come a long way when measured by quality of execution and advancements in technology. So today, if you play a modern game like Call of Duty Black Ops 2, you'll probably hear something like this.
Get ready to move!
Huge evolutionary leaps forward from the days of sound chip-generated bleeps and bloops and simple musical melodies to take advantage of today's modern gaming systems. We now have a treasure trove of game-specific audio tools, technologies, and techniques. Dynamic real-time mixing, real-time DSP parameter control, adaptive and variable audio, and procedural audio. So game audio today is as technically well executed as a feature film. But are audio designers using these fantastic tools to create works of art with their audio? I would argue that with only a few exceptions, the answer is no. Well, how can I say that? How do we know that game audio is falling short of achieving its potential to rise to the level of art? And perhaps more importantly, can game audio ever really be considered art? Should game audio even aspire to being art? Well, like any creative endeavor, game audio can of course be art, or it cannot be art. So how do we tell the difference? How do we know when we've produced art? Well, artistic audio is audio that can be used to craft the story elements of a game, control the pacing of gameplay, enforce the gameplay narrative, elicit and influence emotion, create mood, shape perception, and reinforce the way players experience game characters. The mark of a superior sound design, like many art forms, painting, sculpture, theater, cinema, is one that you don't consciously notice. It works on a person's subconscious, playing with science, subtlety, and tension, manipulating the mood, and drawing the player into the game world. And it's audio that continually reinforces and enhances all other elements of the game, building a complete immersive player experience, which is more than the sum of its parts. So what's the problem? Why haven't we evolved as an industry to deliver experiences that are consistently great, both technically and artistically, as other media have done? Why have game audio designers been held back from innovation? Well, unfortunately, in part, it's because there's always been a prevalent attitude among many in the game industry that audio just really isn't that important. You can't use audio to promote a game in the same way you can promote its graphics. You can't put it on the back of the box. And it doesn't feature prominently in reviews unless it's exceptionally good or exceptionally bad. Also, there prevails an attitude among many game designers and producers that sound's job is to work miracles quickly and cheaply at the end of production, with little or no collaboration in the creative process up to that point. Sadly, sound is an afterthought. And no matter how creative the audio personnel might be, or what their aspirations might be, you cannot create art in such an environment. Games and game audio have the potential to aspire to the highest level of art. But by not attempting to give an audience a deeper and more captivating experience, They will never evolve in the same way that other media have and made the same kind of impact on the world that other media have had. Now, at the heart of this dilemma is an ongoing debate over functionality versus aesthetics. For most game developers, it's sufficient for audio to be functional, to do the job that it was intended for, supporting and facilitating gameplay. As a result, the emotional and psychological functions of sound that would cause the game's audio to rise to the level of art are often sacrificed in the name of utility. But because games are a non-linear form of media, I think that audio designers hide behind our own unique dilemma: how to incorporate expressiveness with interactivity. How do you make sound that is both responsive to user interaction and also emotionally impactful? Why even try? Well, to answer that question, we turn to architecture. The famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright was asked about one of the guiding principles of modern architecture and industrial design, the notion that form should follow function. This is the cornerstone, the foundation of 20th century architecture. It was Wright's opinion, however, that form and function should be one, joined in a spiritual union. And I assert that the same holds true of game audio. Why is it a choice? You can have both form and function. You should have both form and function. And this is something that game creators need to figure out. And they can. But how? By looking at the success that other creative art forms have had over the millennia and adapting it to our own unique opportunities. Now, in order to progress, I believe game audio must finally start to take cues from other aesthetic points of reference, such as film, theater, opera, performance art, musique concrète, while finding its own unique identity, derived from the fact that in a game, unlike those other art forms, events rarely unfold the same way every time the game is played. Artists working in these other media have already struggled successfully with the challenge and opportunity afforded by a multitude of techniques and technologies. They've already solved the hard creative problems, and they've already achieved art in their creative endeavors. Now, although few people realized it at the time, the film industry reached a turning point artistically in 1941, barely more than a decade after the release of the very first motion picture with sound, when Orson Welles produced his masterpiece, Citizen Kane. Now, much has been said and written about the transformational advancements in cinematography and set design and editing that Welles pioneered in that film. But it should come as no surprise, given his distinguished background in radio, that he also changed the perception of cinema sound forever with that same film. Now, the power of radio is that it communicates all its rich storytelling exclusively through the use of sound. This medium allowed Welles to hone his craft and perfect many of his storytelling techniques by relying on the listener's imagination. Welles took the limitations of radio and turned them into advantages. And then he took the storytelling devices he learned and used in radio, and on the stage before that, to film. And the true genius of Citizen Kane is Welles' ability to combine his audio techniques from radio with a brand new visual storytelling language. In particular, Welles uses sound to expand on the meaning on that which is seen on the screen. Let's take a look at this scene in Citizen Kane when the reporter goes to review a manuscript written by one of Kane's closest confidants.
Directors of the Thatcher Memorial Library have asked me to remind you again, Mr. Thompson, of the conditions under which you may inspect certain portions of Mr. Thatcher's unpublished memoirs. Yes, Jennings.
Now, as you'll notice, the sound is highly distorted through the use of echo. Welles' choice to use processed sound was not driven solely by a need to convey the reality of the fact that the scene is taking place in a large marble library. It's meant to add narrative information above and beyond the visuals. that we're essentially in a tomb erected to the memory of a man who's as cold in death as he was in life. In fact, I would argue that Wells may well have set the scene in a large empty hall precisely so that he could have artistic permission to mirror the empty, echoey sound of a mausoleum. It is possible and even likely that the sound design informed the art direction and not the other way around, in order to achieve an artistic effect and make a subliminal impact on the audience to advance an unexpressed concept. And that is art. But the greatest lesson the game industry can learn from practically any other medium about how to elevate audio to the level of art is the concept of ambiguity. In video games, and frankly in most films, unless they're art films, sound usually acts as a vehicle for game creators to project their own interpretation of their game in such a way that it cannot easily be misinterpreted by the audience. So ambiguity is the idea that works of art are open to multiple meanings or interpretation. Now, the best works of art, whether they're films or paintings or pieces of music or stage plays or novels or whatever, is that they create a relatively large canvas on which the audience can, or in some cases must, fill in many of the details themselves through interpretation. These creative endeavors require the audience to make certain very personal assumptions about the work they're experiencing based on their own past experiences and memories, triggering associations that the artist could never have foreseen. Now, a few years ago, I was asked by a client to create a sound effect that sounded orange. To me, this sounded like a ludicrous request and the product of a client that didn't know how to express themselves eloquently. Hence, they resorted to this ridiculous analogy since they weren't able to provide clear and specific direction. For some time finishing this project, I even laughed about this request with some of my colleagues in the industry. But over time, I've come to realize that this sort of creative direction can be a very good thing because it forces the artist to make associations that they otherwise wouldn't if focused on the superficial. It forced me to think about the sound design in terms of feelings and emotions versus acoustic properties. So what does a game with audio that rises to the level of art look, sound, and feel like? Well, believe it or not, there are a few examples of game makers who are going above and beyond to create artistic experiences with the audio in their games. Typically working outside the mainstream on a shoestring budget and distributing their games themselves digitally through services like Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, these few individuals represent the future of game audio design. And one of the most remarkable is a game called Limbo. Produced by Danish game developer Playdead Games in 2010 on a shoestring budget for digital-only distribution on Xbox 360, Limbo is a black and white 2D side-scrolling game where a boy searches through a dark forest for his lost sister. Let's take a look. Now, in this game, the focus is on minimalism, with an emphasis on silence and subtlety. Rather than relying on a traditional music soundtrack, which can be seen as overtly manipulative, the game instead uses sound effects for their musical qualities. Prominence is given to the sound of the boy's movements to emphasize silence and subtlety in the ambient sound and to allow the music to emerge from the sounds of the environment. Now, in 2009, a team from USC, that game company, released Flower as a downloadable game for PlayStation 3. In Flower, the player actually controls the wind, and your only goal is to blow a flower petal through the air. Fly close to other flowers, and your petal will start being followed by other petals. Fields will spring to life, or windmills will start turning. emotions, rather than to follow the traditional conventions of gameplay. The narrative comes entirely through emotional moments and visual analogs. It also features a musical score that dynamically responds to players' actions, and the game also uses the concept of entrainment to induce a trance-like state of calm. He's cute, isn't he? Now, video game development has, from its beginnings, traditionally put the most emphasis on sight over sound. But what happens? What happens if we reduce or eliminate the visuals entirely and instead build a new type of game based entirely on sound? There are some very interesting games doing just this. Games with audio-driven implementations, sonic adventures, and augmented audio experiences that tell their story through sound. You see through your ears. Essentially games where sound is the game. Let's take a look at an amazing game that demonstrates this concept perfectly. Papa Sangre, developed exclusively for the iPhone, drops players in the land of the dead, a land of complete darkness populated only by monsters, where players are tasked not only with staying alive, but also with finding and saving lost souls. Chimes and other sound effects help you to navigate, and you need to listen closely to determine how close they are. Conversely, enemies will growl and snarl and chase you, and you'll want to avoid them. Movement is controlled by the touchscreen, where you take steps forward and then turn to face the sounds. It's a really
Now it's time to leave. Can you hear the exit?
In conclusion, I am certain that over the next few short years, successful game creators will push into new musical and sonic territories and drive deeper emotional resonance into their creations by beginning to focus on audio aesthetics, just as they've done in recent years by adopting some of the principles of visual aesthetics. In order to achieve this, however, the audio leaders of tomorrow must develop a deep familiarity today with the foundations and principles of aesthetics. Just as film sound was pushed into a media language of its own, we will establish a common language for game audio aesthetics. And we need to keep growing that language. We must explore unorthodox paths.